Good morning everyone. Today we will be talking of the development frameworks, aid modalities, and educational planning. Before that, I am Chris De Jesus and with me,
Maricel Diaz Pinili.
Agapito Villa Castillo Jr.
And before we go on to our topic, let us have some review of what we had last week. So we have two topics, Sir Aga.
The first one is about educational development patterns and issues, and the second one is the challenges for educational policy and planning. Doc Acel, about the person which is the educational development pattern and issues, what are the topic behind this one?
Okay, under this topic, we have education for all, comparing participation in education worldwide, and the last one is trends by education subsector.
Okay, how about you, Dr. Chris? About the part 2, which is the challenges for educational policy and planning, what are the topics?
Okay, under the topic of challenges for educational policy and planning, we had the developing specific subsectors of education. We had also the quality of education, the educational equity and social cohesion, and of course,
we have linking learning and work, qualification structures and career guidance. We also have resources for education, and the last one is governance and management.
And today, we will be talking the development frameworks, aid modalities, and educational planning.
Again, we will be discussing the development frameworks, aid modalities, and educational planning. In an increasingly globalized world, educational planning not only responds to domestic factors, but also takes into account commitments made at the international level and goals established collectively by a group of countries. So furthermore, for countries in which development remains dependent on donor support, the planning process itself is at least partly shaped by the modalities of external aid and the tools and procedures defined by the donor community.
Part 1 of this unit overviews the historical phases and the specific frameworks that have shaped the development of educational planning over the last 50 years. And the part 2 looks at the different aid and modalities which have emerged and their influence on policies and policy making.
The objective for this topic is to discuss the implication of international development assistance paradigms and related aid modalities for educational planning. The expected learning outcomes first identify the implication of development frameworks and aid modalities for educational planning. Second, describe the frameworks that have shaped development assistance policies. Third, define the major aid modalities and their implication for educational sector planning. And last, identify the strengths and weaknesses of the aid modalities in the contributing to aid effectiveness, particularly as they relate to the education sector. The part 1 of this topic is about development frameworks and education, which includes poverty reduction strategy, Millennium Development Goals, Education for All, and Fast Track Initiative. Part B is about modalities of development assistance and educational planning, which includes towards new aid modalities, the budget support approach, the sector-wide approaches, and new aid modalities, which about the implication and challenges for policy making.
Educational planning in developing countries must take into account the volume and nature of international resources available for the education sector. This, among others, depend on the views held by the international development community on the role of education in the development process. In a simplified framework, the post-war period can be divided into three distinct periods or phases, which were marked by a very difficult views of economic growth and development and what they implied for the role of education.
In the first phase, dates back in the 1960s when an education was discovered as an engine for economic growth. Education was not simply a consumption good but an essential investment for economic and social development. In this context, educational planning was born.
The OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the UNESCO or the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, spearheaded educational planning in the 1960s and 1970s, working closely together in developing concepts, methodologies, and statistics for educational planning. They promoted the concept of education development as an investment in national economic and social development.
The OECD prompted education planning that was specifically oriented towards education sector development needs associated with post-war reconstruction and economic integration of OECD member states. UNESCO focused on education planning needs in developing countries, many of them having gained independence recently and viewing schooling as a route towards upward social mobility, strengthening of cultural identity, and economic development.
The second phase, in the early 1980s to the mid 1990s, was the period of structural adjustment policies in developing countries triggered by the economic and financial crisis. Structural adjustment policies considered the best approach to achieving economic growth, adopted a narrow concept of development focusing on savings in the non-productive sectors and on rates of economic growth.
Spillover effects from economic growth were supposed to take care of social development issues. Consequently, they included drastic cuts in social sector budgets and investment programs, including in education. Structural adjustment programs had disastrous effects on education system in many developing countries. The loss of purchasing power and impoverishment of the most vulnerable populations contributed to the drive enrollment rates back.
The spillover effects from the economic growth did not occur as was expected. So this could not to compensate drastic cuts in the budget and investment programs in the education sector. Measures referred to as rationalization included a systematic search for savings, abolition for financial transfers such as scholarship and social services for students at primary, secondary, and tertiary education levels. In many countries, teachers' salaries were frozen or decreased in nominal terms.
These measures had negative effects on enrollment rates and education quality in many developing countries, driving back achievements made in many developing countries since the 1960s.
In the third phase, the third development framework known as the Poverty Reduction Strategies or the PRS gained momentum in the mid 1900s. It was based on the broader concept of development that placed poverty reduction and human development at the center of the development process.
Education was given great prominence in this framework as one of the key elements of the human development, in addition to its role as provider of human capital for economic growth. The disastrous result of structural adjustment policies or SAP led to a sea change in the early 1990s. The UNDP Human Development Report was instrumental in triggering a paradigm change toward a basic human needs approach that put new emphasis on sustainable growth and poverty reduction. This development framework gained momentum in the late 1990s when the World Bank turned the fight against poverty into a corporate mission. The Millennium Development Goals of 2000 and the World Education Forum of Education for All of 2000 reflect this basic needs approach and concern for poverty reduction and the equity dimension.
Development frameworks that shape educational planning today. These include in particular two important multi-sector frameworks, the Poverty Reduction Strategies and the Millennium Developmental Goals or the MDGs, which has been placed at the heart of the Global Development Agenda. They also include the education-specific frameworks developed with reference to those multi-dimensional frameworks such as the Education for All or the EFA initiative and the EFA Fast Track initiative or the FTI.
In poverty reduction strategy is from building a large-scale industries and infrastructure to guaranteeing poor people adequate conditions to meet their basic needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. and essential services such as drinking water, sanitation, education, and health facilities.
This approach meant strong involvement of the state in providing these services. This basic human needs strategy, however, lost favor in the mid-1980s because it was found difficult to sustain improvements in standards of living without economic growth. At the same time, the structural adjustment policy strategy was gaining ground as the best approach to promoting economic growth. In the late 1990s, the SAP strategy itself came under criticism and the idea of poverty reduction as a key objective of development resurfaced. A milestone in development thinking was the focus on the human development which pays attention to wider aspects of life, beyond per capita income. These works gave birth to the Human Development Report published annually since 1990 by UNDP.
Each year, the report analyzes various dimensions of human development and ranks countries according to the Human Development Index. In this context, growing attention has been paid to poverty reduction, and the international community promoted a new approach formed through poverty reduction papers.
The rationale for PRSP was based on the three principles. First, the overarching goal of development assistance is poverty reduction. Second, poverty is more than a lack of purchasing power but includes a range of economic, social, and political deprivations. And third, poverty reduction will not be possible in the absence of viable institutions through which people can participate and take ownership of the development process.
While the poverty reduction was also an objective under the SAP framework, it was based on the argument that poverty can reduce through economic growth, which itself can be best stimulated through reliance on market competition. In contrast, the PRSP framework argues that sole reliance on the market mechanism is not an effective instrument for achieving the poverty reduction goal. Non-market instruments are needed to redistribute market produced income in favor of poor people. This is especially true if poverty is defined not only in sense of current income below a certain standard but as a constraint on human capability.
It is also mentioned in the rationale of PRSP that social services such as education, health, and social safety nets are needed to remove these constraints on human capability. Second, there is a need to strengthen the voice and power of people or empowerment and to maximize the initiative of aid recipient communities in the design of development assistance. The last one, it is important to build production capacity of these sectors through supportive measures such as specific vocational education and training. To pursue the strategy, countries were required to prepare comprehensive PRSPs outlining their own plans for poverty reduction. These PRSPs then serve as the basis for concessional assistance from both the IMF and the World Bank, including debt relief under heavily indebted poor country or HIPC initiative. The developing country government is in charge of preparing the PRSP. This is intended to ensure full participation and ownership of the process by developing nations. The document must include four core elements.
The four core elements: first, a description of the country's participatory process; second, a poverty diagnosis; third, targets, indicators, and monitoring systems; and fourth, priority public action over a 3-year timeline. The PRS concept of development was broad one, with human development as its central focus, while SAP was focused on rates on economic growth and did not pay much attention on the other aspects of development.
This description makes it clear that the introduction of PRSPs represented a dramatic shift in the concept of development from the one that underlay the SAP framework. The PRS concept of development was a broad one, with human development as its central focus, while SAP was focused on rates of economic growth and did not pay much attention to other aspects of development.
These are the Millennium Development Goals or targets. 1. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. 2. Achieve universal primary education. Both boys and girls will be able to complete a full course of primary education. 3. Promote gender equity and empower women. Eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education by 2005 and to all levels of education no later than 2015. 4. Reduce child mortality. Reduce by two-thirds the under 5 mortality rate by 2015.
MDG1 has two targets. The first one is to have the proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day. The second one is have the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. Usually we think the poverty purely in terms of economic, such as low income and expenditure, unemployment, debt, lack of land ownership, and poor housing. But this not only describe one aspect of poverty. In fact, the notion of poverty also encompasses other aspects of life such as lack of access to services, which includes education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, and literacy programs or development assistance. There are also social and psychological elements to consider when you think about poverty, which include lack of social contact, limited marriage prospect, poor self-esteem, exposure to stigma, violence, and abuse of authority, and not having the ability to make one's need and feeling known in society. Poverty can, therefore, be thought as the absence of opportunities to lead a life of dignity and respect.
If we think of poverty in a broader sense, the link between poverty and blindness becomes clearer. Poverty can be both a cause and a consequence of blindness. Communities living in poverty are more likely to be affected by vitamin A deficiency, measles, infection, and trachoma, all of which increase the risk of blindness. Conversely, individuals who are blind are less likely to be able to access eye care services, education, or rehabilitation. People who are blind remain impoverished in the broadest sense of the word. There is also a considerable body of evidence that blindness can lead to or exacerbate poverty through lower productivity and an ability to contribute to the family income. Studies have also shown that after successful cataract operations, a high proportion of individuals return to their previous activities.
A successful Vision 2020 initiative would mean that instead of projected 75 million people worldwide likely to be blind by the year 2020, the number of people who are blind would be limited to 24 million. In view of what we just mentioned, this will therefore reduce the poverty and proportion of people with an income of less than $1 a day, as well as the proportion who suffer from malnutrition. The MDGs 2 and 3 also have two targets. The first one, ensure that all boys and girls complete a full course of primary schooling. Second, eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005 and at all levels by 2015.
Approximately 90% of visually impaired children in low-income countries do not go to school, and in most countries, there are more boys than girls in school for the blind. Some of the factors which prevent visually impaired children from attending to school are lack of infrastructure, suitable educational materials, or qualified teachers, as well as distance between home and schools and lack of awareness on the part of the parents. In addition, the lack of provision for children with low vision or refractive errors may also reduce school attendance and academic performance. Blindness among adults in the family may keep children away from school. This is because in many low-income countries, blind adults often depend on children of school-going age and other family members to help them in their daily tasks.
Vision 2020 initiatives can contribute towards the MDG of universal primary education in four ways. First, reducing blindness in adults so that sighted children do not need to stay at home as carer. Second, preventing blindness in children. Third, ensuring that children with significant uncorrected refracted errors are identified and given spectacle corrected they need. And last, linking eye care services to special education or other educational services of children who are visually impaired or blind.
Number 5 target is to improve maternal health by 2015, reduce the maternal mortality ratio by 3/4. Number 6, combat HIV or AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, halt the spread and begin to reverse the incidence of HIV or AIDS and other diseases. 7, ensure environmental sustainability, build sustainable development policies into country programs and practices. Have by 2015 the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water. By 2015, achieve a significant improvement in the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers. And number 8, develop a global partnership for development.
MDG4 has one target, which is reduced by 2/3 the mortality rate among children under 5. It has been estimated that up to 500,000 children become blind each year. This roughly means that a child becomes blind every minute. It has also been estimated that in low-income countries, up to 60% of children who become blind die with 1 or 2 years of becoming blind. The most important reason for this is that many of the conditions that lead to blindness in children are also causes of child mortality. Example, measles, vitamin A deficiency, congenital rubella syndrome, or meningitis.
Global initiative to control vitamin A deficiency and measles infection are succeeding not only in the preventing child death but also in preventing blindness. One of the Vision 2020 target is to eliminate corneal scarring in children by the year 2020, and another is to almost have the prevalence of blindness in children by controlling the avoidable causes. Both of these targets, if achieved, will contribute towards reducing child mortality. Vision 2020 activities can also reduce child mortality by improving water supplies and sanitation in areas where trachoma is endemic. It's likely to reduce diarrhea, which is an important cause of vitamin A deficiency in children.
MDG6 has two targets. One is halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV or AIDS, and another one is halt and begin to reverse the incidence of malaria and other major diseases. People living with disability, including blindness, may be more exposed to infectious diseases because they are often not included in health promotion activities and cannot receive health education messages which rely on a good vision. Example, posters. People who are disabled also have reduced access to outreach and treatment services and find it more difficult to follow treatment instructions if these are in written format. In short, preventing blindness may help to reduce the incidence of infectious diseases such as HIV and malaria.
Supporting Vision 2020 helped to strengthen global partnerships for development. In addition, Vision 2020 may help to combat neglected infectious diseases through the example of the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control, or the APOC. APOC has been highly effective at delivering mectizan to millions of people in Africa on an annual basis. This provides a successful model which has been adapted for the delivery of health intervention for other infectious disease. For example, the impregnated bed nets for malaria control. MD7 has one target: to reduce by half the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water. One of the proponents of the SAFE strategy for trachoma elimination is to improve environmental hygiene by improving water supplies and reducing the number of potential breeding sites for flies. If this E, or for environment component, the SAFE strategy could be implemented in areas where trachoma is endemic, this would be contribute towards achieving the MDG7.
MDG8. The action countries must take a regional, national, and international level in support of MDGs 1 to 7. The strength of Vision 2020 lies in the existence of strong partnerships at all levels. At the international level, AIPB represents WHO and over 70 international and national organizations involved in the prevention of blindness. At the national, regional, and community levels, Vision 2020 encourages strong partnerships between ministries of health, national and international organizations, professional organizations, and civil society groups. These are brought together in National Prevention of Blindness and or Vision 2020 committees, which aim to improve eye care services and eliminate avoidance or avoidable blindness. Supporting Vision 2020, therefore, helps to strengthen global partnership for development.
17 in cooperation with pharmaceutical companies which provide access to affordable essential drugs in developing countries. Vision 2020 programs ensure the availability of essential drugs for blindness prevention through the establishment of international, national, and regional partnership for the control of onchocerciasis, trachoma, and childhood blindness.
Education for all and its relationship with PRS and MDGs is a key strategy for empowerment and democratic participation. It is also directly linked to MDGs. MDG 3 identifies gender parity in education under its target, which is also an education for all goal.
Education for All, or EPA, had its origins in the Chongqing Conference on Education for All, which was held in 1900s. 10 years later, it was widely felt that insufficient progress had been made towards achieving EPA objective. At the World Education Forum in Dakar in year 2000, governments, non-governmental organizations, and multilateral and national development assistance agencies pledged to commit the necessary resources and effort to achieve the comprehensive and inclusive system of quality education for all. It is line with the Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG. EFA is under the SGD4, which is about the ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all.
Towards 2030, a new vision for education to transform lives through education, recognizing the important role of education as a main driver of development and in achieving the other proposed SDGs. Other one, motivated by our significant achievements and expanding access to education over the last 15 years, we will ensure the provision of 12 years of free, publicly funded, equitable quality primary and secondary education, of which at least 9 years are compulsory, leading to relevant learning outcomes. Other one, commit to making the necessary changes in education policies and focusing our efforts on the most disadvantaged, especially those with disabilities, to ensure that no one is left behind. Committed to supporting gender-sensitive policy, planning and learning environments, mainstreaming gender issues in teacher training and curricula, and eliminating gender-based discrimination and violence in schools. We commit to quality education and to improving learning outcomes, which requires strengthening inputs, processes and evaluation of outcomes and mechanism to measure progress. We commit to promoting quality lifelong learning opportunities for all, in all settings and at all levels of education. We commit to developing more inclusive, responsive, and resilient education systems to meet the needs of children, youth, and adults in this context, including internally displaced persons and refugees.
The Sustainable Development Goal 4 targets by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes.
The provision of 12 years of free, publicly funded, inclusive, equitable, quality primary and secondary education, of which at least 9 years are compulsory, leading to relevant learning outcomes, should be ensured for all without discrimination.
Second is to ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education.
The provision of at least 1 year of free and compulsory quality pre-primary education is encouraged to be delivered and well-trained educators as well as that of early child development and care.
Next is to ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university.
It is imperative to reduce barriers to skills development in technical and vocational education and training, or TVET, starting from secondary level, as well as to tertiary education, including university, and to provide lifelong learning opportunities for youth and adults. The provision of tertiary education should be made progressively free in line with existing international agreements.
Substantially increase the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills, for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship.
In terms of access, equitable access to the vet needs to be expanded while quality is ensured. Learning opportunities should be increased and diversified using a wide range of education and training modalities. In terms of skills acquisition, beyond work-specific skills, emphasis must be placed on developing high-level cognitive and non-cognitive or transferable skills such as problem-solving, critical thinking, creativity, teamwork, communication skills, and conflict resolution.
Inclusion and equity. All people, irrespective of sex, age, race, color, ethnicity, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property of birth, as well as persons with disabilities, migrants, indigenous people, in children, in youth, especially those in vulnerable situation or other status, should have access to inclusive, equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities.
In gender equality, all girls and boys, women and men should have equal opportunity to enjoy education of high quality, achieve at equal levels, and enjoy equal benefits from education. Adolescent, girls, and young women who may subject to gender bias violence, child marriage, early pregnancy, and heavy load of household chores, as well as those living in poor and remote rural areas, require special attention. In contexts in which boys are disadvantaged, target of action should be taken from them. Policies aimed at overcoming gender inequality are more effective when they are part of overall package that also promotes health, justice, good governance, and freedom from child labor.
Action for this target aims at ensuring that by 2030, all young people and adults across the world should have achieved relevant and recognized proficiency levels in functional literacy and numeracy skills that are relevant or equivalent to levels achieved at successful completion of basic education.
The knowledge, skills, values, and attitude require the citizens to lead productive lives, make informed decisions, and assure active roles locally and globally in facing and resolving global challenges that can be acquired through education for sustainable development and global citizenship education, which include peace and human rights education, as well as intercultural education and education for international understanding.
There are three means of implementation. First is to have an effective learning environments, build and upgrade education facilities that are child, disability, and gender sensitive, and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive, and effective learning environments for all. Second, scholarship. By 2020, substantially expand globally the number of scholarship available to developing countries, in particular least developed countries, small islands, developing states, and African countries, for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information and communication technology, technical, engineering, and scientific programs in developed countries and other developing countries. Third is for teacher and educators. By 2030, substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers, including through international cooperation for teachers training in developing countries,
especially least developed countries and small island developing states.
The Fast Track Initiative, or the FTI, was established in 2002 as an evolving global partnership of developing and donor countries and agencies to support the core EFA goal of universal primary completion, or the UPC, for both boys and girls by 2015. The Monterrey Agreement, initiated by 22 bilateral donors, development banks, and international agencies active in supporting education in low-income countries, explicitly links increased donor support for primary education to recipient countries' policy, performance, and accountability for results.
We have five main goals for Fast Track Initiative. First, more efficient aid for primary education. Second, sustained increases in aid for primary education. Third, sound sector policies and education. Fourth, adequate and sustainable domestic financing for education. And fifth, increased accountability for sector results.
Participate in the program after approval through an FTI review. This approval requires both the PRS and an education sector plan document. In other words, participating countries are required to demonstrate that they have a well-developed plan both for poverty reduction and for education sector. The education sector plan must offer a costed strategy for accelerating UPC that is aligned to sector goals for quality, participation, and other priorities. The review process begins with the submission of sector plan by the government. The assessment and endorsement process is conducted in-country led by local donor agency representatives. The FTI Secretariat, composed of World Bank and other agency officials, provide a coordinating function at the international level on behalf of the donor agencies. When the country donors are satisfied the key issues has been adequately addressed, the sector plan is endorsed. The implementation FTI endorsement in a country is based on a agreed principle of accountability, annual monitoring and evaluation, strengthening and statistical and analytical capacity, and education management information system, or EMIS.
The guiding principle on fast track initiatives are strong emphasis on country ownership, as FTI is a country-driven process. Use of indicative benchmarking to improve primary education outcomes. Long-term and stable support linked to dedicated commitment shown by countries. And reduce transaction costs to countries through good donor coordination based on a swap approach.
Modalities of development assistance and educational planning contains new 8 modalities, the budget support approach, sector-wide approaches, and new 8 modalities which contains implication and challenges of policy making. There are two key characteristics of new 8 modalities. Aid was generally conditional and it is project or program related.
The criticism of aid modalities that prevailed until the 1990s. The aid modalities prevalent before the poverty reduction strategies, or the PRS era, were clearly dominated by the supply-side economics. They had two key characteristics. First is aid was generally conditional, granted if the recipient countries met certain conditions. Furthermore, most aid was project or program related. Project-based assistance was the main mode of aid delivery. Aid evaluation during the 1980s and 1990s had identified several major problems with the project-based approach.
These are the major problems with the project-based approach: high transaction cost, inefficiency in spending, unpredictability, ineffective governance system, and adverse impact on accountability system.
Recipient countries face the high cost of managing aid when they had to deal with a large number of projects. Many donors also face high transaction costs with their own reporting and accounting requirements and schedules. The project-based approach made it easier for the donor countries to impose their own priorities and procure their own contractors, thus leading to inefficiencies. Funding levels were very unpredictable as they depended on the disbursement levels on the implementation requirements of many different projects.
Multiplicity of projects imply that the use of non-government project management system and staffing structures in parallel with government systems weaken the governance system of recipient countries. The project approach required the use of donor or country and accountability mechanisms, which had negative effects on the development of recipient country accountability systems.
The budget support approach refers to the channeling of donor funds to a partner government using its own allocation, procurement, and accounting system.
The approach was developed to support poverty reduction strategies, hence the use of such terms as poverty reduction budget support and partnership general budget support. Budget support is linked directly to the government's plan for poverty reduction. This is to achieve two principal methods.
These are the two principal methods: by shifting away from project aid to a programmatic form of aid, and by shifting away from a policy conditionality towards a more partnership-based approach.
Within the broad PRS framework, the approach attempts to recognize the recipient government's preeminent role in defining government priorities in accounting systems. The absence of conditionality is reflected in the fact that the aid funding to government is not earmarked to specific projects or expenditure items.
Here are the two forms of budget support. One, general budget support or the GBS. It is linked to policy measures related to overall budgetary priorities. Second, sector budget support or SBS. It covers financial aid that is earmarked to a specific sector or sectors without any conditionality.
Covers financial assistance as a contribution to the overall budget. If there is any conditionality, it is linked to policy measures related to overall budgetary priorities. Within this category, funds may be nominally accounted for against certain sector, but there is no formal limitation on where the funds may actually be spent. Covers financial aid that is earmarked to a specific sector or sectors without any conditionality. The aid is reported through normal government accounting and recipient government's disbursement procedures.
Budget support generally includes a basic agreement between the recipient country and its aid partners about the country's aid strategy and objectives, and the general principles of the development cooperation.
A Memorandum of Understanding or MOU often reflects this agreement and set out arrangement for regular dialogue about general policies and use of budget support.
Budget support also includes specific agreements about the amount of budget support to be provided and the condition for its disbursement.
Usual a general condition that the government will adhere to the broad understanding set out in the MOU, plus specific conditions for the disbursement of budget support funds. The specific conditions usually include a set of agreed policy measures that the government will undertake. Some donors link at least part of their disbursement to the achievement of the set of performance targets.
Budget support also includes an agreed procedure for monitoring and review of performance, and also it is accompanied by programs to strengthen public finance management.
This monitor and review is integrated into the preparation of subsequent installment of budget support. Among other things, the budget support donors monitor the country's public expenditure as a whole. Budget support donors systematically monitor the quality of the country's public finance management systems.
It attempts to manage and deliver assistance on the basis of policy considerations for the whole sector. A sector is defined as a coherent set of activities that can be relevantly distinguished in terms of policies, strategies, and programs. Sectors can be economic sectors, social sectors, and thematic sectors.
By focusing on a sector, SWAP moves away from the project-based assistance. The reason for this shift were to address the difficulties of the project-based approach, which have been described above. Although SWAP development independently on the sector budget support or the SBS approach, the two are clearly related. The SWAP is directly linked to the poverty reduction approach in that the sector priorities are developed on the basis of a PRS.
It follows the PRS framework and it represents a move towards a partnership approach in which recipient governments are empowered to develop their own priorities and a shift away from project-based assistance.
Proponents of SWAP argue that development assistance in this framework is a unique process between each donor-partner relationship, and there's no ideal template to follow or propose. However, as in the SBS approach described above, there are a number of steps in the process that can be identified.
SWAP is negotiated process. 1. Pre-SWAP. 2. SWAP planning and implementation, which contains sector policy, sector strategy, sector development program or SDP, and the medium-term expenditure framework or the MTEF.
Pre-SWAP, even before the approach can be considered, it is important to conduct a feasibility study to show that the country has an enabling environment in which SWAP can work. This usually means that there is a high level of political support for SWAP.
SWAP planning and implementation, we have sector policy and sector strategy. And of course, we have also the sector development program and the medium-term expenditure framework or MTEF. In sector policy, a coherent policy of sector development based on PRS is the first prerequisite for implementing SWAP. The existence of such policy signals that the capacity to develop sector policy exists, that the government has its own ownership, that the sector policy has been developed after consultation within stakeholders. Sector strategy, the sector policy document needs to be supported by a strategy document that identifies how the policy will be implemented. Ideally, the strategy should be medium term. It should identify qualitative and quantitative targets and identify a mechanism for review.
In sector development program and the medium-term expenditure framework or the MTEP, this should describe a rolling multi-year plan of resources and expenditures, developed in consultations with the Ministry of Finance together with appropriate procurement arrangements. The main objective of an MTEP is to link planning to resource allocation by providing a longer time horizon. An MTEP can facilitate the implementation of longer-term priorities, such as those encapsulated in the MDGs, in poverty reduction strategies, and in sector-wide approaches, each of which take a multi-year perspective and have implication for the budget provision that will need to be made in the medium to long term.
SWAP planning and implementation also includes annual plan and budget planning and annual plan and budget execution. Aside from pre-SWAP and planning and implementation of SWAP, we also have SWAP management and donor or government dialogue.
Planning, the multi-year SDP should be accompanied by an operational annual plan for implementation. In budget execution, the actual implementation plan must make detailed arrangement for cash management, accounting, reporting, and procurement procedures. SWAT management represents a paradigm shift from a donor to a recipient-managed approach. This places a high premium on the recipient country's capacity and management of the process for SWAP success. This capacity must be a national in scope but must also represent a decentralized sector level. There should be an ownership of SWAP at the core level of the relevant ministries, and it should include national stakeholders. The details identified in Step 2 necessarily imply a degree of decentralization. Hence, local structure need to be given authority. Local structure become the modus operandi for SWAP.
In donor-government dialogue, a swap process led by the national government includes a parallel dialogue and relationship between the lending agencies. This dialogue is needed at all levels of the steps identified above, especially as the sector development plans are prepared. The dialogue itself goes through a number of steps: establishment of a letter of intent, a code of conduct, a national consultative forum including all functioning agencies and non-governmental organizations, and measure for harmonizing donor procedures. A successful swap also requires that donor agencies actively coordinate their actions on the basis of the sector development policies document so as to avoid working at cross purposes. It is particularly important to bring donor agencies to agree to donor nations' approaches.
It should be noted that the Paris Declaration provides a rule-based umbrella framework for aid delivery and management, while the other four modalities mentioned above are all nested within the broader framework of the PD. The Paris Declaration has succeeded in providing rule-based guidelines for improving aid effectiveness. It has rightly placed ownership of development policies in the hands of partner countries and provided approaches to reduce transaction costs and increase efficiency and accountability in aligning development assistance to national policies. These are worthy intentions, but according to two recent studies, the experience so far reveals a gap between the intention and the outcomes.
Is the most apparent on the issue of partner or country ownership of development policies. While it's about intention is to increase partner ownership and to strengthen development partnership, the mechanism it has put in place may have been unwittingly curtailed rather than increase development countries control their policies. Several factors could be contributed to this.
Asymmetry of responsibilities regarding accountability and the challenge of linking plans and budgets.